My name is James, and I have definitely spoken at a conference before. So, funny story. I was my wife was in California with her mother. She's from Southern California last week, and when she heard I was coming here, she says, "That sounds like a cult." Now, for clarity, she had no idea I was coming to speak at a church conference. She just heard Moscow, Idaho, and was like, who knows the town Moscow? She just thinks the town is a cult, right? So, see, this is how you know you're not a cult. Like, a real cult wouldn't laugh at cult jokes, right? A real cult would have vetted their speakers better as well. Like, honestly, I halfway through the day, I started to worry that I was going to be underdressed to be a speaker at this conference. And then I realized, being here, that I'm actually underdressed to be an attendee at this conference. You guys look great. I lead the Al-Maida initiative, right? And Al-Maida is an Arabic word that means a table full of food and conversation. And so what we do is we're trying to equip Christians in local churches to engage Muslims here in our cities. So many of you may be asking the question, are there Muslims here? Of course there are. You guys live in Moscow, huh? Worst dad joke of the conference award. But actually, when I first came out here to sort of pitch this on Election Day 2020, the conversation I had with Doug, I don't know if is that too informal? Okay, great, because I came through I found you guys through Apologia, so I'm lacking proper manners. But when we were talking at lunch, he was like, "Hey, what you do sounds great. We're not really sure how many Muslims we have here in Moscow, but we'll look into it." So then I go from there to Boots's. Is that how you say it? Yeah. Okay, great. And I see these two Arab-looking guys sitting there. So I'm like, "Hey, Intum in Saudi?" And they're like, "How did you know we were Saudi?" And I said, Arabs living this far out of the city, you guys have to be Saudi. Now, I don't know if that's a real stereotype or not. I just made it up. But they laughed, so we got talking. I told them what we do, and they say, "Well, really? Because we are the leaders of the Saudi student club here in Moscow, Pullman, and we represent 300 Saudis living here, and we would love to do events with the church here." So there's a bigger field for this here than you might think, and anywhere you're living, there's probably going to be some Muslims somewhere. So my goal today is to kind of give you an overview of what Islam is, not just as a historic idea, but also how it's kind of incarnated around you, right? So I could give you a pretty lengthy overview of Islamic theology, and we'll definitely go over it, but I also want to explain to you how it's lived and why it's lived that way, and then tomorrow we'll talk about how to kind of put that into practice as you actually engage with the Muslims you meet. So I really started noticing Islam probably the same time many of you did on 9/11. I was walking home from school. My friend's mother ran out the house in tears, and at that time, one plane had hit the World Trade Center. At that point, we thought it was a tragic accident, and then as we were watching the second plane hit the tower, and everybody realized something much more sinister was at play. So at that point, though, I was an 11-year-old boy, and both my grandfathers were in World War II and had all these exciting stories, and the world seemed much more interesting back then, and England at the time seemed comparatively boring. So my 11-year-old reaction is, that's really bad, but life's much more interesting now that we have this bad guy to fight again, right? And that's what Islam was for me as an 11-year-old boy. 2 years later, I started taking Christianity much more seriously, and then I'd say Islam transferred from geopolitical enemy to a theological enemy, and not much more than that. But then once I hit sort of 19, I was in the place where I actually started to interact with Islam a little bit more. I started to look at some of James White's debates. I would sometimes go to Speaker's Corner in London. If you don't know what that is, Speaker's Corner is a corner of a park in London where people literally get up on boxes and they yell things at each other. It's really fun, right? But it's not productive. So you've got like you've got an older communist guy speaking to three people. You got some Christian preachers talking to just general people. Then you get Muslim speakers. And in the middle, you've got Christians and Muslims yelling at each other, right? 3 is 1, 1 is 3. This doesn't make any sense. How did you people reach the moon, right? That's the kind of dialogue going on there. And by the way, yeah, 1 rocket, 3 stages. And so that was kind of my interaction with Islam was just this kind of like, it's a big part of the world, and people yell things about it sometimes, right? But then when I was 19, 20, I don't remember anymore, I was doing a sort of college course where I had to make a sort of radio production. So like a talk radio show, so I decided to interview different people about their views on the end of the world. So I found some more missionaries, talked to them, got someone from my church, talked to him, and then I thought, okay, what's an interesting third worldview to add to this? So I walk around the town, and I said, let's find a Muslim. Didn't know any Muslims, so I walked past the T-Mobile store, and I saw a woman wearing a hijab, and I'm like, hey, are you Muslims? Like, yes. Can I interview you for a radio show about the end of the world? She's like, sure, but I have to finish my shift first. So we talked, and that basically convinced me that I need to go and actually read the Quran for myself, right? I've read about it in other books. I've heard James White talk about it. I've heard other Christians talk about the Quran. But if I'm going to be regularly interacting with Muslims and this Muslim friend, I should actually read it myself. So I read through it chronologically, and what every Christian needs to know about the Quran has a great chronological reading plan. So I just sat down in a coffee shop for 3 days and just kind of powered through the whole thing. Now, for those of you who think reading the Quran is an intimidating task, it can be, but it's actually shorter than the 4 Gospels combined. It's not an immensely long book, but it is quite hard to read through because it doesn't have any narrative structure to it, right? It's all prose poetry, ordered from longest to shortest. And it's, again, as Doug said, it's only considered the Quran when in Arabic. But there's actually even another layer to that as well. Like, there's kind of various phases of Arabic, right? There's dialectical Arabic that people actually communicate and think in. Then you have Fusha, which is formal Arabic, which is what the books are written in. And then Quranic Arabic is like even higher than that. I mean, we're talking like Shakespeare, maybe even Beowulf type language, right? So just because somebody speaks Arabic does not mean that even they understand the Quran. So one of the Saudi guys I met here told me there was a Saudi guy moving to Seattle the week later and asked if I could pick him up from the airport, which I did when I got back. And he told me that as a Saudi, he needs somebody to translate the Quran from Arabic to Arabic, right? So what I realized pretty quickly is that most Muslims don't really base what they believe on the Quran itself, functionally, right? Now, it's not to say there's nothing integral to Islam which is in the Quran. There are some things, and some of the things is the themes of kind of monotheism versus polytheism, right? The premise is people around us are worshipping lots of gods, but there's only one God. You've also got the theme of Muhammad himself. He's actually not mentioned very often in the Quran, only 4 times, I believe, but he's called the final prophet, the seal of the prophets, the messenger of Allah, and that is a theme in the Quran, right? The Quran establishes his authority as a prophet. We have the idea of the Day of Judgment as well, and the way the Quran frames the Day of Judgment is as 2 scales, right? Where it's a weighing up of good deeds versus bad deeds, and if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you'll go to paradise. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you'll face God's judgment. That's essentially the way the Quran views judgment, when you add supplemental material, it gets way, 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 way more confusing than that. I was having a conversation with two friends who are formerly Muslim about, how you count good deeds versus bad deeds and how complicated it is, and, how if you pray in a mosque, it's more valuable than praying, outside of a mosque. And if you pray in Mecca, it's 50 times more valuable. And if you sin in Mecca, it's like 100 times worse, and all these things. And my Saudi friend says, yeah, why do you think the Muslim world is so good at math, right? It gets complicated once you move outside the Quran. And then another really interesting theme in the Quran is this idea of the people of the book, the al-kitab. So Surah Al-Ma'idah, if you see what we did there, says, let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah hath revealed therein. If any do fail to judge by the light of what Allah hath revealed, they are no better than those who rebel. Great, right? So, my naive 20-year-old me thinks, okay, this is great. The Quran says people who believe the gospel should stand on the gospel. So I'll just do that, and I'll say, look, the Quran says the Bible's good, you should read the Bible. Easy. That is not how it worked. But why? Like, why did the kind of commands and things written in the Quran seem so distant from the average Muslim? So, I kept learning. So right after I moved here, I had a lot of time to listen. I moved here to intern for Mars Hill Church. That exploded. Met my wife, though, so it worked out fine. And I ended up working at a company started by Christians, and I was finding myself in a bit of a bubble and wanted to get out of that a little bit and interact with non-believers more. So what I could do at work is listen to audiobooks. So I decided to listen through the Book of Mormon because I'd run into Mormons a bunch and wanted a slightly better answer than, oh yeah, I read about you guys on Wikipedia and watched South Park. So I wanted to I wanted to actually be able to say, yeah, I read it myself and interacted with it myself. And then once I was done with that, I decided to start listening through something called the Hadith, right? Which is like, we'll get a little more to that later. But it's kind of a collection of, it's like an encyclopedia of everything Muhammad said and did, categorized into topics. And so I listened through two of these major sections, and then thought, okay, well, this is a very academic exercise. I don't actually, know any Muslims. But when I was kind of reading this, that's where you start to get the actual biography of Muhammad a little bit more, right? It's not chronological, but there are some early biographies, and the story, as it's given to us, is that there's a city called Mecca in Arabia, and Mecca is essentially the sort of hub of idol worship in Arabia, and everybody comes in caravans, bringing tributes and offerings, and that's how the city's economy functioned, right? And the idea is that there's a guy called Muhammad who's born in this city as an orphan, and then in 589, he is praying in a cave. He's wondering what to do, which religion is true, where to find God. And the angel Gabriel appears to him and says, recite. And he says, I don't know how. He says, recite. I don't know how. And then the angel squeezes him and says, recite. I don't know how. And then he starts reciting the words of the Quran in that cave, right? And the Quran literally means recitation. So he goes to his wife, Khadijah, who's a successful businesswoman, who's very tribally well affiliated, and he starts, he tells her, look, he says, cover me, Khadijah, because I'm possessed by the spirit of a jinn or a poet. Jinn is genie. That's something in Arabian folklore, and it's actually a part of Islamic theology. Not in the Aladdin way, but it's more complicated than that. We can't really get into it now. But then Khadijah says, no, this is from God. You are a prophet, and you've got a message. So for the next few years, Muhammad starts teaching his message to his kind of immediate sort of family. His wife and daughters become Muslims. Some of his friends become Muslims. And then there's his nephew Ali becomes a Muslim, and his uncle Abu Talib doesn't become Muslim. It's like, I don't believe you, but you're a good man. I like you. And basically protects him, right? So Muhammad is a minority prophet holding a minority view in a polytheistic place, but he's protected by his tribal affiliations. But he's also disliked because, again, this city depends on the idol trade, right? But then, unfortunately for Muhammad, in 622, both his uncle Abu Talib and his wife Khadija, his main source of protection, they both die, and he is forced to flee from Mecca to a city called Medina. So this is in the year 622. This also marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. And this is significant because when Muhammad moves to Medina, he's not just moving cities, he's moving to become the head of this city, right? So notice that the Islamic calendar does not start when Muhammad's born. It does not start when the Quran is revealed. It does not start when he starts his public ministry. The Islamic calendar starts when Muhammad ascends to political power, right? The history of Islam is measured from the beginning of like an Islamic state, functionally. And so in Medina, Muhammad's position completely transforms. So in Medina, he says in the hadith, I am the master of the children of Adam, and it is no boast. I will be the first for whom the earth is split on the day of resurrection, and it is no boast. I will be the first to intercede, and whose intercession will be accepted, and it is no boast. The banner of praise will be placed in my hand, and it is no boast. He also gains absolute political control. Now, I don't want you to hear this and assume Muhammad is a crazy tyrant all the time, right? It's really, really easy for us to villainize Muhammad, right? It's easy for us to be against Islam, to not think it's true, and therefore look for everything wrong with him, right? There's instances of good things, instances of bad things, but one thing you absolutely see, without a shadow of a doubt, is that he has absolute political and religious control over the city. So he says in Sahih Muslim, whoso obeys me obeys God, and who disobeys me disobeys God. Whoso obeys my commander obeys me, and whoso disobeys me disobeys my commander disobeys me. Right. So there's a very absolute structure of authority established in Medina. At this time, we also get this idea of the Sahaba, and Sahaba means companions, and the idea here is that the best people to ever live in human history are the first 3 generations of Muslims, and that if you want to be righteous, then you have to imitate these 3 generations of people. Now, that's not all Muslims who believe that, but it's a major belief, especially in Salafi Muslims, right? Salaf means follower, so they're trying to imitate these companions. So over the next few years, Muhammad's power grows. He starts raiding Meccan trade caravans, which leads to 3 battles. The Battle of Badr, which the Muslims win against overwhelming odds. You've got the Battle of Uhud, which the Muslims lose. And then finally, the Meccans go all the way to Medina, surround it, and then they are defeated by a very well-dug trench and a good strategy on part of the Muslims of Medina. So after this point, Muhammad starts pushing further and further out into Arabia with raids, with armies, with missionaries, and basically takes over all of the country except for Mecca at this point. So in 630 AD, he surrounds Mecca with an army of 10,000 people and negotiates its peaceful surrender. And there's only 5 people executed when he takes over Mecca. He generally establishes amnesty for all the people who opposed him previously. But then 2 years after conquering Mecca, Muhammad died, and this started an entire succession crisis. And this is where we get the idea of the caliphate, right? So from the time Muhammad died up until 1924, there was an office in the Muslim world called the caliphate, right? And the idea of caliph means successor or deputy, right? So the successor of Muhammad himself. And that's what ISIS was about. ISIS was about trying to re-establish that lost caliphate. You guys remember that, right? That was a weird year. Despite 3 people arguing for it, Muhammad's best friend and father-in-law, Abu Bakr, is the one who got the job. And as soon as his caliphate was declared, basically most of Arabia basically said, okay, we're not paying your taxes anymore. We're going to make our own prophets, and they kind of appoint new people to be prophets in their own cities. And then Abu Bakr wages a year-long war and basically reconquers all the territory that Muhammad conquered. And this all comes to a conclusion in 632 with the Battle of Yamama. I'm sorry, guys. No, that's how it's pronounced. But it's a significant battle because at this point, the Quran isn't actually written down, right? It's all recited by people in the community, which means that it's reliant on people memorizing it. But at this battle, about 800 men who have memorized the Quran die. So at this point, Abu Bakr says, okay, we got to actually kind of write this down. So he makes, an almost complete copy of the Quran and saves that. And so Abu Bakr then pushes the Islamic Empire into Persia, but then he dies of old age, and then a guy called Omar takes over. He takes things further. He wages military campaigns successfully against the Byzantines and the Sassanids until he was assassinated by Sassanid assassins. That is my favorite sentence to say in this whole presentation. So then his successor Uthman, right? As the Islamic Empire spreads across the world, from Egypt on one side to Transoxania on the other side, modern-day Turkmenistan. Does that help anyone? People know where Turkmenistan is? One guy does. It's a really fascinating place. You got to check that out. That's a whole other tangent, though. As the Islamic Empire is expanding, you're starting to get some discrepancies on how the Quran is recited. So what Uthman does is he basically collects all the Quranic manuscripts. And I'm going to read this because it sounds like I'm making up if I don't. This is in Sahih al-Bukhari. It says, Uthman sent to every Muslim province one copy of what they had copied and ordered that the other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burned. So the state had an approved version of the Quran, and they burned the rest, right? And that's not a secret. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. That is in the source materials. So that's how you kind of get the Quran as we have it today, mostly. It's not to say there's no change, but it's pretty accurate. It's pretty consistent from that time. You have a state-controlled manuscript, and then you have basically from Muhammad's death, you have 100 years of Islamic expansion. And on the one hand, it stops in 717 AD with the siege of Constantinople, where the Byzantines deploy Greek fire, burn the fleets, rout the army, and then in 732, when Charles Martel raised a professional army and defeated the Muslims in the Battle of Tours. So Islam stopped expanding at that point, and then it went through what's known as the Islamic Golden Age. Now, one really, really important thing to know about the Islamic Golden Age is that the worldview was not like modern Sunni Islam during the Islamic Golden Age. There's actually a guy called Wasil ibn Atta, who in 744 created a school called the Mu'tazilites. You don't need to remember all these names, by the way. I just want you to know how complicated it is. So the Mu'tazilites was a rational school of Islam that believed it was syncretistic. It believed, yes, God sent the Quran, but we also need to understand Greek philosophy, science, Persian philosophy, Indian philosophy. And so there's a guy who in 787, Harun al-Rashid, built something called the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And what he did is he collected all of the literature of the world together in one place in Baghdad, and this is kind of the peak of Islam. At this time, you get things like, guitars, you get ice cream, you get coffee starts to kind of become a bigger thing in the world, and you also get algebra as well. So again, it's important for us to know that the Muslim world is again, it's not an army of orcs, it's image bearers of God. And there's good and valuable things that the Muslim world has given us, right? It's not a simple metric of Christians good guys, Muslims bad guys, right? We have to have a nuanced view on this. So my Muslim friends always tell me, why does everyone think we're terrorists? We invented algebra. It's like, that's why! But in all seriousness, right, there's things we can thank the Islamic Golden Age for, and we can thank the Mu'tazilites for, right? But the Islamic Golden Age does not represent, modern liberal democracy by any stretch of the imagination, because what's happening at this point is the Mu'tazilites are the official school of thought of the Caliphate, which means dissenters are put in prison. So in 813, Caliph al-Ma'mun puts a guy called Ibn Hanbal in jail because he's a traditionalist Muslim. He's a guy who wants to take the text literally and interpret it and use historical grammatical process to things like the hadith and the traditions. But he's arrested. But then a guy called al-Mutawakkil, who is considered the last great caliph of the Islamic Golden Age, he changes his mind and he likes Ibn Hanbal and he releases him from jail and starts persecuting the Mu'tazilites, right? The one thing that does not change is the unity of state and religion in one entity, right? And when that guy changes his mind, the whole Islamic world changes, and then it faces a period of decline until it's basically taken over by the Mongols. But at this point, Ibn Hanbal has a student called Imam Bukhari. And Imam Bukhari wrote something called Sahih al-Bukhari, and this is kind of the beginning of something of the hadith, right? This is the main hadith collections, and the main hadith collections that Sunni Muslims use are basically completed over a 100-year period from 200 years after Muhammad to 300 years after Muhammad, right? So this is a later source, and this is really where modern Sunni Islam really gets its roots. Now, the Quran is very short and accessible. The Hadith, on the other hand, is very, very large, right? Basically, out of these 6 volumes, let's say each one is about as large as the whole Bible. And again, it's like an encyclopedia. So you don't read the Hadith to get a narrative of Muhammad's life. You use it like an encyclopedia. If you want to know what he did with a certain topic, you look up the topic that you're looking for, and you find out what he'd say to that, right? So that's how it's categorized. And most Muslims are not encouraged to look at that. So this is actually where we get the 5 pillars of Islam, which is the Shahada, the confession that there's one God, Muhammad is prophet, the 5 daily prayers, the zakat charity, which is 2.5% paid to the state for helping the poor, the fasting during Ramadan, then the pilgrimage to Mecca. And then we have the 6 pillars of faith as well, which includes belief in God, belief in the prophets, angels, day of judgment, belief in predestination, although they still argue what that means, and then belief in the holy books, the Torah, the Gospel, and the Injil. So again, we have that theme again, that there is reference back to the previous scriptures, right? So what this means is that when initially talking to Muslims, there can be a difficulty because they have an idea of Christianity is kind of pre-baked into their religion. The sources themselves, like the Quran itself, doesn't really say the Bible's corrupt, but if you believe what the Quran says, you kind of have to make that conclusion or stop believing the Quran. So you've got a lot of Islamic tradition saying, yeah, the Bible's corrupt, you can't trust what it says, and that's kind of pre-baked into Islam, whereas the Christian, right, because the Bible comes 600 years before Islam, we're just not even thinking about Islam on the same level. So it can be hard for us sometimes to be able to respond to things that people have been sort of given this script their whole life, and we're like, wait, who are you? What? So at this point, after reading this, I thought this was a very academic exercise, so I decided to try and make some Muslim friends. So I decided to crash the Muslim Student Association at the University of Washington. So I wasn't a student, my wife was at the time. So I walked in super awkwardly partway through one of the meetings, and the door was like right behind the speaker. Everybody saw me come in. But then, one guy, waved at me, offered me a seat, and says, "Oh, you should come back next week." And I did not need another invitation. So I just kept going back. I ended up going to that place for 6 years. I hold the record for the longest attending member of the Muslim Student Association at the University of Washington. But I didn't go to start any trouble. I just to listen, learn, make friends, and then have good one-on-one conversations. But what I'd find as I talk with people is that there's a certain point that the conversation would just kind of have this kill switch, right? That, oh, I can't really talk to you anymore about this. I'm not a scholar. I don't really understand this. And so I was trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? Why doesn't anyone want to talk about this stuff? Why won't people have conversations about this? And what I start realizing is that not only are the Islamic source materials like overwhelming in size, right? They're very, people are actively discouraged from reading them as well. And here's why. Firstly, there's very much an idea of groupthink baked into early Islam. So in one of the hadith, in Al-Timaridi, Muhammad says, "My ummah," means community, ummah, community, "my community will never agree upon an error." And then there's another one that says, "Allah's hand is over the group, and whoever diverges from them diverges to hell." Right? Contrast that with Exodus 23:2, which says, "You shall not fall in with the many to do evil." Now, just to be clear, I don't know any Muslims who'd say, if everyone else is doing evil, you should do evil as well. But notice the disposition here, right? The disposition of Exodus is you watch out for the crowd, right? Whereas Islam is like, expect the crowd to say and do the right thing, is essentially the difference there. And then, well, how does that crowd guided? Well, Muhammad also says, scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. So this idea is the Muslim community is supposed to be guided by scholars who take Islam forward and are supposed to be the people you ask for advice and get your information from. So just a note here before we sort of jump into what's next. I want to explain some words to you, right? So the word alim in Islam means scholar. Another title is mufti, which means law decider. The word sheikh or sheikh means honored old man, basically. And then you have the title imam, which means leader of the prayers. Notice what's missing from those titles. What's missing is any implication that any of these people are invested in the lives of the people that they're supposed to lead. There's no aspect of shepherding in these titles. These are all like religious functionaries who do specific tasks to do with academia. So to quote Sheikh Yasir Qadhi on the Muslims' relation to the source material, he says this: "In theory, one can say that the average Muslim is not qualified to go back to the Quran and Sunnah directly and needs a tutor or needs a mentor or needs a scholar or a guide. Let me give you an example. I am not a medical doctor, so when I am sick or when a loved one is sick, what do? I don't just open up the books of medicine and tell this person take this medicine or tell myself to take this medicine. I go to someone who is trained in the science, who is trained in medicine, and I ask their advice. Similarly, when one does not have an Islamic training, he or she must go to a scholar, and that scholar is considered to be trustworthy in these issues." So, the average Muslim is told, you do not have the capacity yourself to understand the Islamic source materials. Therefore, what's your job? Your job is to listen to the teachers, to ask them good questions and obey what they say and trust their judgment ultimately, unless you want to go and get an Islamic training yourself, in which case you can go to an Arab country for 6 years, learn Hadith, learn Arabic, and do all that. Otherwise, you defer to the community by deferring to its leaders, right? But how does this work for the average Muslim in our cities, right? So imagine with me a young Muslim woman in Moscow or Pullman, whichever suits you best. Her parents moved here from Syria, right? Her name is Hafsa. She's nice, right? She's a nice person. She's fun to be around. And Hafsa is influenced by all sorts of things. She's not influenced purely through the Islamic source materials. She's influenced by, historical Islam. She's influenced by her parents' culture, which is influenced by Islam a little less directly. She's influenced by Western culture, and she's also an image bearer of God. So she is influenced by her conscience, right? But she is not encouraged to read the Quran. So what's going to happen is she's going to have a circle of people around her who she relates to. So she has her parents who are also nice people. They tell her some things about Islam. She has, her grandparents who tell her things about Islam. There is an imam at the local mosque, but she doesn't talk to him about Islam. Maybe once a year at Ramadan, he says, Hafsa, how are your grades? And she says, oh, good, inshallah. And that's about it, right? Her information comes from her family, comes from her community, comes from her friends. She has a slightly more feminist aunt who still calls herself Muslim and gives her a different version of things. She has a more seriously, Muslim aunt. And then her dad has a brother called Crazy Uncle Hafiz. And Crazy Uncle Hafiz is kind of makes really, really good food, but it's kind of has some kind of out there and kind of extremist opinions, and everyone just kind of ignores him, but keeps him around because family is family. And so Hafsa is going to have things coming to her from this culture. Some things she finds inspirational, but they're fake, right? So there may be a story about Muhammad being super nice to a Jewish neighbor that finds its place nowhere in the source materials, right? She has some things that are inspirational and authentic. Muhammad spared Mecca and didn't kill everybody when he took it over. That's really great. There's some things that are authentic, but just aren't that interesting that she hears. And there's some things in the source material which are sort of troubling and authentic, right? That she'll hear Crazy Uncle Hafiz, say things like, there's more women in hell than men, and she's like, yeah, okay, Hafiz, good for you. But she doesn't really have a standard by which she can judge what's coming to her, right? So functionally, she has a filter, and that filter says Muhammad is the best of creation, right? And that means that Muhammad would do all the best things, and he wouldn't do the worst things, right? That's who Muhammad is. But the way she defines best, what she defines as good, is not purely taken from the Islamic sources. It's taken from all these things around her. It's taken from movies. It's taken from culture. It's taken from American culture. It's taken, yes, from the Islamic source as well. So her filter is a mix between the kind of people around her and her own conscience, right? And so where she gets her, so the actual authority in Islam is not the source material, but it's the community, right? That's where the information is coming from. So functionally, what that means is Hafsa builds her own version of Muhammad, which is basically like an amalgamation of all the best things in her family and culture, right? But then when we as Protestant Christians want to go and critique the historical Muhammad, we're not critiquing someone that the average Muslim recognizes, because our approach to text is so different because we've been informed by a biblical worldview, right? So we need to understand that the actual source of her authority is not written in text somewhere. And I'm not saying you shouldn't understand the texts. I'm just saying they don't have a huge bearing on the life of the average Muslim, right? So in theory, the foundation of the Islam is supposed to be Quran, the traditions and the Hadith, then the scholars, and then the community. In reality, the foundation of Islam for most Muslims is the community, and then the scholars, and then the Sunnah, the traditions, and then the Quran, right? Which they don't really relate to all that much, right? But that's a much easier task for us, right? Because guess what? Hafsa, the average Muslim, believes the Quran implicitly, never reads it. But what's her actual foundation? The actual foundation is this family around her, right? So the family around her tells her the Prophet Muhammad is the best of creation. And she says, yes, absolutely. The family around her also says, according to the hadith, you must enter the bathroom with your left foot first. And then Hafsa says, no, I don't think so. It doesn't really make sense to me. Right? She already knows there's a problem with this information, right? She knows there's a problem with how she's getting her information from. So instead of trying to act like the whole conversation is about Jesus versus Muhammad or the Bible versus the Quran, it's actually about what everything's about, which is this. Are you going to trust the words of God, or are you going to trust the words of men? And that's the actual authority battle in the life of the average Muslim, right? So why does she believe the Bible is corrupt? Well, because the community has told her the Bible's corrupt. But there's already things that the community has told her that she doesn't believe in. So what you're going to find, actually one thing that illustrates this for me, I was on a flight from Turkey to Los Angeles, and I sat next to this Palestinian woman, and she had 2 kids, and I asked her, so not right away, we made small talk first. So what I asked is, so where do you get your information about Islam from? And she said, I'm having a hard time with this because all the scholars are on the payroll of some government somewhere, and I don't trust the governments that pay them, so why would I trust the scholars? So then later on, she said, okay, here's a question. Okay, you're Christian, I'm Palestinian. What do you think about Israel and Palestine? It's like, great question. So we talked about why God chose Israel and why it was there to bless not just Israel, but all the nations of the earth, all the families of the earth, all the tribes of the earth, and how Jesus' sacrifice, the sacrifice of the promised Messiah, was going to sprinkle many nations with his blood. And that if she trusted Jesus as the Messiah of Israel, as Lord and God, that she could receive all the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whether or not she was an Israelite. And to which she said, that's really interesting, but I've been told the Bible's corrupt. I said, who told you that? The scholars. So I said, okay, the same scholars that you don't trust, you trust them when they say it's corrupt? She says, I don't know. Right? How much easier is that, right? She already knows she has a problem there. So what you're finding in the Islamic world right now is you're finding a lot of voices who want something different, who are striving for something that's better, but they think that's hidden somewhere within Islam, right? They're looking for a true, pure version of Islam, which is about love and goodness, that they assume is buried under all the traditions. So listen to this. A guy called Mansour al-Nagadan, who's an Emirati living in Saudi Arabia, he says, Islam needs a reformation. It needs someone with the courage of Martin Luther. Right? Can anybody say low-hanging fruit? But then listen to this, right? It says, Muslims are too rigid in our adherence to old literal interpretations of the Quran. It's time for many verses, especially those having to do with relations between Islam and other religions, to be reinterpreted in favor of more modern Islam. Now notice how, while he points to Martin Luther, he absolutely does not understand what the Reformation is. Right? The Reformation does not have a standard of modernity to try and adapt itself to, but it's actually going back to the foundations to figure out what's true underneath it. Right? There are people who are doing that in the Muslim world, and those people tend to be scary and unappealing to the average Muslim. So if you talk to, I've talked to a lot of Afghan refugees in the last few months, everyone you talk to will tell you, look at the Taliban, those Taliban, they do not represent real Islam. Okay, who does? I don't know, I'm not a scholar. Right? And it's very pronounced in the Afghans, but this is true everywhere. People are looking for ways to kind of redefine themselves, and they're trying to figure out who they are, what they believe, and what they actually stand for. So the average Muslim, the average Saudi, living here right now, believes that modern Islam is broken. You don't need to convince them of that. They believe that there must be some true version of Islam buried underneath the rubble somewhere, and then, but also doesn't feel qualified to search for it themselves because they've been told that you're not qualified to understand God's word. And we actually have something different to say about that, that you are an image bearer of God. You are created to be able to understand the God who created you and to be able to read your word, read his word yourself. So, what's interacting with Muslims almost every day at this point in my life, what breaks my heart the most is that there is a huge opportunity that people are not seeing, because we see Muslims as people with a coherent worldview who have a plan and have a plan to sort of take over the country, and we just don't know how to interact with people who are so confident. But it's just not the case. And the note I want to leave you on is Matthew 9:36-38. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to the disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." So that's what I have for you today. And then tomorrow we'll talk more, and you can find out what that is on the next exciting episode of Dragon Ball Z.